All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. We're doing this today as a video episode that we'll probably release also an audio version today. I'm going to bring my guests right up to the show. So, Tara, welcome. It's your first time on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. So, I thought we'd take a little minute for you to kind of introduce yourself. Many folks I know will know you from social media and from some of your writing. We're going to discuss a piece that you wrote for Vox Ummah. And their bio for you is simply Tara Alami is a Palestinian writer and researcher from occupied Jerusalem and occupied Jaffa. Is there anything else you want to share kind of with our audience about yourself to give us a sense of who you are before we get into this discussion?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm a long-time listener of the podcast, so I'm really honored and happy to be here. I think the bio for that piece and for Vox Ummah is pretty much everything or the only things that are important about me. I'm Palestinian from occupied Jerusalem and occupied Jaffa, and I am a writer and a researcher. I'm also an organizer. I'm a member of Palestinian Feminist Collective. And I used to be a student organizer back in my undergraduate days. And I grew up in Jordan, which is, I guess, relevant for this episode and what we're going to talk about. All four of my grandparents and some of their siblings ended up in Jordan after being exiled from Palestine in 1948. So from my dad's side, my paternal grandfather, his family, just went, straight to Jordan from Lid and Jerusalem. And then on my mom's side, it was a bit more complicated because they had to go through, Lebanon and Syria. And eventually in the 1950s, they came to Jordan and settled and became Jordanian citizens with a national number, which is an important distinction because not all Palestinians that ended up in Jordan as refugees or as, I guess, non-registered refugees in UNRWA or whatever, have a national number, which, limit what you can access as like a citizen, even if you'd been living there for decades. And that's like the case for many Palestinians living in the Gaza refugee camp. And so that's, I guess, a bit of background about me and or in relation to Jordan and me being Palestinian.
Yeah, thank you. So just say a little bit more about what a national number is and how that, how that differentiates, I guess, levels of people, like not levels, but, folks within Jordan.
Yeah, I mean, it does create a hierarchy of like access to services and access to rights, and access to just basic life stuff in Jordan. It kind of functions like a social security number. And so it's a series of numbers that is associated with your ID or with your passport. And so technically in Jordan, you can have a Jordanian passport and not have a Jordanian national number, which would limit your access, for example, to education. It would limit your access to opening a bank account or make it harder. It would limit your access to getting healthcare. Of course, like we're talking about people that are impoverished in this case because they had been marginalized, whether like geographically placed into like a refugee camp or just otherwise marginalized because they're Palestinian in Jordan. And so they actually need these services, right? And this is like where, the creation of agencies like UNRWA and other refugee relief agencies becomes like another tool for keeping people in that sort of permanent state of refugeehood, permanent state of displacement, where like you can't actually, you've been living in this country or in that place for like 3 generations now. You've had kids, your kids have had kids, and you still are not technically recognized by the state as a citizen that deserves or should have access to basic services like healthcare, health insurance, school education, and so on. Not to say that these services are like extraordinary in Jordan, but obviously are necessary for people. Like most of Jordan's population relies on these services, relies on public education, relies on public healthcare for generations. And so this is what the lack of a national number means. And there's also a different, I guess, type or category of Palestinian refugees that have what is called like a wathiqa, which is a piece of paper that proves that you are a Palestinian refugee. That is, there's Egyptian ones, there's Jordanian ones, there's Syrian ones. And this is essentially like your makeshift passport. And so it creates, obviously, so much restriction on mobility, but also it puts you in this position where you have to consistently renew your residency in the place that you're living. So every 6 months, every 1 year in Jordan, you have to show up, you have to renew your residency, obviously pay a fee for that. And then you, again, like can't access public services. You'd have to pay for private school, like send your kids to private school. And obviously there's so many wealthy Palestinians that have access to that and like are able to afford that. But again, most Palestinians are not going to be able to afford it and are again like forced into this like state of permanent statelessness, displacement, humiliation at borders, humiliation when trying to access services, and just like a permanent like stripping of dignity, I think, like at the core of it.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to. I appreciate you kind of adding all of that context. I think it's helpful. So let's talk a little bit about Vox Ummah as a platform. We had a live stream previously with Mamadou Tal, who I know has been involved from the beginning, but it's still relatively new. So I just wanted to also invite you to share a little bit about it, for folks who may not have encountered it yet, and talk a little bit about why you wanted to write a piece for them as a platform.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a Muslim anti-imperialist platform, and of course, Mamadou is a comrade and a friend, and I wanted to support this great initiative. I think, especially in the past, I would say, 10 years, 10 to 15 years, but also more clearly in the past 2 years with the acceleration of the genocide in Palestine. We have seen like a rise of reactionary Islamic politics, right? Sectarianism, this sort of like playing into the empire's rhetoric of Sunni versus Shia. This XYZ is a Shia proxy of Iran and so on. Demonizing the resistance or the access. And planting like these seeds or replanting these seeds of sectarianism back in our minds, as like Arabs, as Muslims, too. And I think like now is the time to actively fight against that, right? So I thought it was really important to open up this like this front for like discussion and discourse. And so I really appreciate like the team that put that platform together and came up with this idea and so on. And when it comes to Jordan specifically and why I wanted to write this piece like specifically as my contribution to the platform, Jordan is one of those places where the sectarianism is quiet and like silent, but it's very much still there, right? Like Jordan is one of the countries that was intercepting Iranian missiles towards the Zionist state. Jordan is also one of those states that is building these close relationships with the Gulf states. So this reactionary Sunni, like Wahhabi Islam, that is obviously aligned like with the goals of Western hegemony over the region. And so like bringing Jordan into the discourse and into the conversation in that way, I think was important because and I can talk about this later, like whenever we get into my experience like going to school in Jordan and growing up in Jordan. But really like the we are like placed into the state of just like forced depoliticization. But, you know, like to me at least, it's not depoliticization or it's not an apolitical stance. Like it's very much political for me. Like that in and of itself is a political condition that we're forced into of silence and an acceptance of like the status quo. And the status quo obviously in Jordan as what can be called like a semi-colonial state, or as a place that is a target of Western imperialism and has been for over 100 years, includes like that sectarianism, and it includes the demonization of what is now of resistance that is now taking shape in or taking the form of Islamic resistance, regional resistance that is Shia in its like character. And so yeah, I think opening up that like that discourse for us, obviously for like Muslims all over the world, but for us as Arab Muslims who are like thinking through the current geopolitical changes and regional changes that are happening and being forced upon us in the region, is really important. And so, you know, I invite everyone to like check their website out and read their pieces. They have some really good analysis on modern Islam, on dialectical materialism, communism and Islam, and so I really appreciate the work that they've put out so far.
Yeah, I do as well. I think it's great. All right, so let's dig into this piece a little bit. So let's just start by talking about kind of at a high level. You said a little bit of this, but maybe there's a few more pieces you want to go into of sort of what was the intervention that you kind of wanted to make in delving into this history, and the kind of analysis you wanted to engage in this article.
I mean, there's a few interventions I wanted to make. One of which is not really like written in the piece itself, and it's like the actual writing of the piece, like writing it and putting it out there as someone who grew up in Jordan, as someone who's like Palestinian with Jordanian citizenship and nationality, and really like actively or proactively intervening in the silence that is like or the silencing that is forced upon us. And so like writing that piece in and of itself took a little bit of thinking for me, because obviously like the state of the current state of surveillance and repression in Jordan is exponentially worsening. And so it took a bit of thinking of like, you know, is this really worth it? Should I write this? Should I not write this? And to me, the answer was, yes, it's worth it. I should write this. And, you know, it's not that if no one does, you know, who will. And so I have to do it and I have to be the hero. It's just that, to me, like refusing to take that risk as someone who is obviously living in the West and like working in the West and has been living here for like since I went to university, and as someone who is able to tolerate or like afford that level of risk, refusing to take it like felt like a betrayal of the Jordanian people, of people who are being like repressed at a level that has never been seen before, like unions and syndicates that are being crushed for organizing protests for Palestine. People that are being arrested for raising the Palestinian flag at a Palestine protest. People that are being tear gassed for protesting in front of the Israeli embassy in Jordan. And so that's really the first intervention that I wanted to make, that at some point we will have to compromise some sort of level of security to be able to actually change things. And there has to be like some risk that is associated with wanting to intervene in the like dominant discourse when it comes to Jordanian politics and the internal conditions or domestic conditions in Jordan. The second intervention that I wanted to make was really with like starting with the custodianship of Al-Aqsa and Al-Aqsa compound, and later, you know, all of Jerusalem's holy sites by the Hashemite family. Because the way that we learn about this in Jordan, like what we're taught about this is that, you know, this is a very honorable, you know, this is an honor that was bestowed upon the royal family, and they are custodians of our holy sites, which obviously insinuates that they are caring for them, they are protecting them from the aggressor, they're protecting them from the Zionist occupation, from incursions, from attacks on the literal like infrastructure of Al-Aqsa compound, because that's the goal, like they're trying to destroy it to dig under it and so on. And like placing that in the larger context of the role of the Jordanian monarchy and the role of Jordan like as a nation state, geographically, regionally, and as like as a hub for US imperialist presence in the region, and obviously earlier British, like at the times of the British Empire. And reframing like that understanding of this position of the Jordanian monarchy as like carers of these holy sites, with the history of the ruling family's collaboration with the British, the Americans, and of course the Zionists, and the Zionist regime. And also questioning what it means to actually be like custodians of Palestinian holy sites, what it means to be given like that honor, but also failing to actually like do what you were supposed to do. Like the attacks on Al-Aqsa have not stopped. In fact, they've only increased. The attacks on Palestinian Christian sites, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Palestinian Christians have not stopped. In fact, they only increase, and especially around Christian holidays. The attacks on Christians in Beit Lahem have not stopped, and I know that's obviously outside of Jerusalem, but it's really this larger context of, okay, like you're you know, we're taught about this great honor, and we're taught about this custodianship, and you know, we are taught to be really proud of the royal family for taking on this like task of protecting these holy sites against the Zionist state and against the Zionist occupation, when in fact the protection has only consisted of renovations after the fact, like after they're attacked. Changes in, you know, changing the glass in Al-Aqsa compound in the Dome of the Rock, or in the Aqsa Mosque itself after Israeli soldiers set grenades off inside the mosque. And so I think like starting with that reframing sort of starts to like break down all of this conditioning that we've been like given since we were young, and is like a starting point to begin understanding like what is the role of the Jordanian nation state when it comes to Palestine, not just when it comes to the Palestinian who decides, but just like the Palestinian liberation struggle. What is their role when it comes to propping up the Palestinian Authority and the Oslo Accords? What is their role when it comes to signing deals with the occupation that lease Jordanian, like literally Jordanian land to the occupying state, for them to have their own settlements there? And also, what's their role when it comes to the Israeli occupation literally rerouting and leaching off the Jordan River, the site where Jesus is said to be baptized, and like rerouting them to their occupied land? And why are we not fighting against that? Like why is this not an active confrontation that is happening? And why is this happening like right in front of our eyes? And really, like when I mean right in front of our eyes, if you go to the Jordan River in Jordan, the difference between how it was 10, 20 years ago and the amount of water that is literally left in the Jordan River today is like sickening. And then you see these evangelical Christian Americans coming to get baptized on the other side of the river, which is, Israeli occupied land. And you see the Israeli soldiers there, and just like the level of proximity to the occupation, but the lack of confrontation is really like the point that I wanted to make. Starting with like the custodianship of Al-Aqsa, but then obviously going to like where we are today and why we're where we are today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's start with some of the kind of early history that you go into in this article. You brought it up. You note how, quote, custodianship of Al-Aqsa and later all of occupied Jerusalem's holy sites became a legacy of the Hashemites, Jordan's ruling family, end quote. And you also talk about how, quote, despite Jordan not yet being a member of the United Nations, the king at the time, King Abdullah I, was the only Arab leader to accept the 1947 UN plan for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. So for those who don't know this history as well with respect to kind of Jordan's role, could you say a little bit about the early stages of this relationship between Jordan's ruling family and Zionists, but also Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank?
Yeah, I mean, we have to start with the earliest Hashemite that is, I guess, that is relevant to the conditions of the Arab world and the way that the geography was drawn, like the borders were drawn in our region. So it starts with Sharif Hussein in Mecca, who is King Abdullah I's father. And so the Hashemites come from this, they're one of those families that are called Ahl al-Bayt, that are from what is now Saudi Arabia, but are directly, like, can directly trace back their roots to the Prophet. There are many families like that, including mine. So it's not like it's not an extremely like special, thing. Like a lot of us originate from that place in the world as Arabs and as Muslim Arabs. And so Sharif Hussein in Mecca was approached by the British before Jordan's independence. And like I want to say independence in quotes from the Ottomans first, because they had been, like the region was ruled by the Ottoman Empire for about 200, 300 years or something. And so approached by the British and was given this proposal to rule over, for his dynasty to rule over the land. And so that includes two of his sons. There's Faisal, who was given Syria by the French. And then Abdullah I was given Jordan by the British. And so the British at that time found readiness for collaboration and for just for collaboration from the Hashemite family and from the head of the family, the patriarch Sharif Hussein, who was very obviously important in Mecca. He was the Sharif of Mecca. So in exchange for revolting against the Ottomans, that was the deal. And they found also that King Abdullah I, so the son, was also very ready and accepting and open to further collaboration with the British. And so really, like, if you think about it, and if you think about where we are today and how things have progressed since that time, Jordan, the geography of Jordan was created as sort of this like buffer state to protect the growth of the British Empire on Arab land, and also the upcoming Zionist colonization of Palestine. And so really like the geography, and obviously we all know that geography and the actual borders were so arbitrary, and were just designated by Sykes-Picot and just divided based on balancing the powers of empire on our lands, and and so that's what happened. Abdullah the First was placed as the ruler of what becomes Jordan, and is ready and open for collaboration with the British. King Abdullah the First was designated the ruler of this land, and specifically chosen for his readiness to collaborate. And really, like, something that's really important that I mentioned in the piece was that at the time of the first Arab-Israeli war, in 1947 and 1948, the head of the Jordanian army was a British general. And so the way that Jordan was, or like the way that the British were entrenched in Jordanian state affairs, did not actually like change or transform after independence in 1946. Like maybe there weren't as many boots on the ground as before 1946, but the state of like affairs and the status quo and the way that these state apparatuses worked in Jordan were still determined and like just effectively led by the British. And so what happened was that, you know, the Arab-Israeli war happened, and Jordan was an active participant in that, obviously on the Arab side, but led by a British general. And so many Jordanian soldiers were sent to Palestinian land, and obviously we know how that ended. It ended with a massive defeat of the Arab armies, and the brutal and cruel like ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and the exile of Palestinian families, and including mine, from their land. And so after that, the custodianship of Al-Aqsa was given to the Hashemite royal family, and with that came like this, you know, like request to protect these holy sites and so on, and everything that we just spoke about. But one of those, I guess, tasks was just like regularly visiting Al-Aqsa compound, and going to Palestine, and you know, doing these tours as the royal, as the ruler of Jordan. And King Abdullah I was assassinated on the grounds of Al-Aqsa compound by a Palestinian who used to be part of the Great Revolution of 1936 to 1939, and was an active guerrilla fighter at that time. The Palestinian who assassinated King Abdullah I was immediately killed on the spot. But the one of the witnesses to the assassination was his grandson, King Hussein, who would later grow up to be the king of Jordan, you know, maybe 10 years after that, or something. And so I think like that antagonism between the Palestinian people and the Jordanian people was sort of set up at that point, because the assassination of King Abdullah I was an explicit attempt at showing opposition to collaboration between the British and the Jordanians. And I think like what was and is still the correct analysis of Jordan being sort of this buffer semi-colonial state that exists to hinder any efforts at the liberation of Palestine, like the entire land of Palestine, but also to provide this place for the empire, the British, now US empire, to exist on this land unopposed, as many military bases and NATO offices as you want on Jordanian land, and also like to exist as this. I would say at least as like the beacon of what it means to be a stable country that is a peaceful place in exchange for massive suppression of political freedoms, massive suppression of any dissent or opposition, even if minimal, to the status quo and to the ruling family.
So you also write about the period specifically from 1967 up until 1971, where at times Jordan's military joined Palestinians in military operations. But as you note, there are kind of plenty of contradictions in that and in this period as well. So would you be willing to go into some of that history?
Yeah, so I mean, this is during the time of King Hussein's rule as the King of Jordan. He became king really young, at 18 or 17, because his predecessor, King Talal, was actually sent to a sanatorium in Turkey for having schizophrenia and lived there for the rest of his life until the 70s. And so King Hussein, this, I'm 26 now. I can't imagine being like a royal in charge of an entire country at 17, 18, but had been prepared and groomed for this position since he was a child. Like even his grandfather would take him on his visits to Al-Aqsa. He even, like I mentioned, witnessed the assassination of his grandfather by a Palestinian in Palestine. And so with that comes a lot of obviously prep on diplomacy and politicking and so on. And though he was young, I think King Hussein was one of like the most strategic and calculated and pragmatic rulers that I think we've seen in the region. And really at this time, like during this period from 67 to 71, was when there were so many geographic changes happening in the region. Of course, in the 50s, there was the Sinai crisis with Jamal Abdel Nasser and the Zionist state and the British and the French. And then going from the 60s to the 70s, the beginnings of the war of attrition in Egypt. But specifically in 1967, obviously the occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza. So with these geographic changes, like comes a huge I'm like forgetting the word, but a huge amount of refugees, Palestinian refugees, come from Palestine to Jordan. And so that includes refugees from Gaza, it includes refugees from the West Bank, it includes refugees from Jerusalem. And at that point, the difference between those of us who were exiled in 1948 and those who were exiled in 1967 becomes clear, because a lot of us that came as Palestinians to Jordan in 48 and the years that followed, like up until the mid-50s, were naturalized as Jordanian citizens in exchange for Palestinian citizenship. So many people, after years of being exiled and no sight of return, no return in sight, or no possibility of return in sight, had exchanged their Palestinian documents for Jordanian ones in order to be able to work, to go to school, to raise their families, to live, and so on. But in 67, so many of these refugees are given what I mentioned before, like the wathiqa, the piece of paper that is like a makeshift, passport that proves that you're a Palestinian and stateless, are placed in refugee camps, and there's and Jordan's Palestinian population increases in size. And even now, like if you really think about it and do the calculations and look at the data and so on, most of Jordan's population is either Palestinian or Palestinian by heritage, like half Palestinian, a quarter Palestinian, or whatever. And so most of us right now are Palestinian, and the tribal Jordanian families are actually a minority in terms of Jordan's population. So with the occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza, obviously tensions had increased between the Jordanian monarchy and the Zionist state. There were all of these refugees that were coming to Jordan. Jordan was still growing, like the economy was growing at the time. It was underdeveloped, but that doesn't mean that there's, I think, like, underdevelopment doesn't mean that there's a lack of development. Jordan was exiting the sort of semi-feudal colonial mode of production and moving towards a capitalist mode of production. This is the time where we start seeing a lot of US aid packages to Jordan. We start seeing a lot of more military and surveillance training exchange between the British and the Jordanians and the Americans and the Jordanians. And so these relationships with these relationships between King Hussein and the Americans and the British are being solidified at the time. And yet the Zionists, obviously under the approval and instruction of the Americans and probably the British at the time, had transgressed what was the agreement, which was the 1947 partition of Palestine, and occupied the West Bank and occupied Jerusalem and Gaza. And that created a lot of regional tensions. And so in 1968, the Battle of Karame, which happened actually on Jordanian land, where the Zionist forces actually experienced a massive defeat because Palestinian guerrillas and the Jordanian army collaborated and jointly defeated Zionist forces at that time on Jordanian land. And there's a recording actually which is heartbreaking, and I love and feel like a lot of love towards and appreciate the fact that it was archived. It was of a Jordanian soldier who was at the Battle of Karame and was surrounded by these Israelis. And in the recording, he directs his commander or whoever he's talking to via the radio to strike him and to strike where he's where he is, like, at that moment, like his position, to take out all the Israelis around him and essentially to be a martyr. And to me, like, this was like the highest depiction or illustration of the will of the Jordanian people at the time when it came to confronting the Zionist state and confronting the Zionist occupation, and their commitment to defeating the Zionist forces on their land, like on Jordanian land, on sovereign Jordanian land that, yes, is obviously sovereign but dependent on the empire. But this is like, these are people who are soldiers who are part and parcel of the state apparatus that are directly confronting the enemy through that state apparatus, and also like openly and explicitly saying, like, I will be a martyr for Palestine and for Arab land and for Arab sovereignty and nationhood as a Jordanian soldier. And so these contradictions started propping up, like a lot of actually Jordanian soldiers started defecting from the military, and they formed this group called the Free Officers. And so these were Jordanian soldiers that started after the Battle of Karame with the increased repression of Palestinian guerrillas and Palestinian groups in Jordan in the 70s, before their exile from Jordanian land, their removal from Jordanian land, had started openly disagreeing with the monarchy's policies. And that included martial law. It included the besiegement of neighborhoods that mostly had Palestinians living in them, like El Webde or Jabal Hussein. Like these were neighborhoods that were, I guess, hubs for Palestinian families that were besieged and during Black September bombed. You know, my dad, when he was a child, lost two of his fingers and half of his third finger because he found a grenade and in front of their home and was just playing with it and it just exploded in his face. And that was in the late 60s, early 70s. And so these were the conditions that Palestinians were living under at the time. And obviously, my father survived, like, thankfully, but so many didn't, right? I remember, like, my uncle on my mom's side telling me that my maternal grandmother would ration bread at the time during the besiegement of these Palestinian neighborhoods. And so the contradictions were sharpening at like an exponentially increasing degree. And there were these Jordanians that started openly opposing the monarchy's role in crushing Palestinian resistance. And this is obviously like at the time where Pan-Arabism was declining, and during the war of attrition in Egypt, the main goal of the West and the US empire was to crush this pan-Arabist, revolutionary, nationalist commitment to removing US hegemony and Western hegemony from the region physically, like the physical removal of these of the empire from the land. And so, of course, as an ally of the British and the Americans at the time, King Hussein had followed that trend of crushing the resistance, crushing a resistance that was committed to these, maybe in different not iterations, but like expressing it in different ways, but committed to these principles of independent, sovereign, Arab, Palestinian, Jordanian, Egyptian, Lebanese, Syrian lands that were free of US and Western encroachment, that were free of these wars of aggression, that were free of being crushed at any attempt to nationalize native resources like oil and gas and so on. And so these free officers had rebelled against the monarchy, and obviously, with the way things went, had eventually been crushed, and eventually the Palestinian resistance factions were forced to leave Jordan at the time, and forced to go to Tunis, and then figure things out, and just had also been betrayed by yet another Arab state that was supposed to house them. And like now is like where you start seeing, like with after the 70s, after the 80s, you start seeing King Hussein's like calculated strategy when it comes to like peacemaking, and when it comes to like crushing the Palestinian resistance, maintaining those so-called red lines when it comes to Palestine and the custodianship of these holy sites, but also working towards what we now see as like full normalization, full diplomacy with the occupation, and really a protection of the presence of the Zionist occupation on our land.
Yeah, thank you for that, breakdown of that history. So let's talk about that period that you referenced next, right? Which is this period, you talk about King Hussein as a strategic peacemaker, right? And specifically, you kind of focus on this period of 1971 through 1994, when there's a peace treaty. So do you want to go over some of that in depth as well?
Yeah, I think, at the time, at the time, so many changes were happening in the world, specifically during the 90s, the late 80s, the fall of the USSR, the depoliticization of the PLO's revolutionary program, and like the exchange of the Palestinian Liberation Organization's commitment to militant resistance, into like for the exchange of that for sort of like a diplomatic state building project, asking for recognition of a Palestinian state rather than the liberation. And so these changes that were happening around, across the world, but around the region, also obviously affected the way that Jordan, like the role that Jordan played at the time. And so I think, this period of change, like reactionary change, but at the same time, within that, there was some revolutionary change and some revolutionary moments. Like, for example, the first Intifada started in December of 1987 in Hazde. The shift from sort of the PLO's, I guess, secular sort of Marxist-Leninist analysis of resistance to a more Islamic lens of resistance, the rise of Islamic resistance in the region, especially after the Lebanese civil war, the rise of Hezbollah as a resistance group, the revolution, the Islamic revolution in Iran. All of these things were sort of changing the balance of powers. And at the same time, Jordan was developing as a country. Obviously developing under complete and total dependency of the US and the West in terms of like economic aid packages and so on, that have only increased in size and increased in volume since then. But also, hopping on this moment of modernization, becoming this modern state in the region, in the face of rising Islamic resistance, or the rising tendency of resistance that takes shape through Islam. And part of that was, of course, like peacemaking efforts. Egypt had already normalized relations at the time. Lebanon was just exiting, or was going through, like from 1975 to 80, to the 80s, through the civil war, and had sort of produced, as a result of the civil war, the Islamic resistance movement, Hezbollah. Iran had gone through this shift, had kicked out the reactionary Shah regime, and had gone through this revolutionary change, had begun nationalizing resources and so on. Like I mentioned, Egypt was already on the path of normalization. And so that leaves Jordan in a very interesting geographic spot, right? Also at the same time, the Gulf War was happening, between Kuwait and Iraq, and there were all of these tensions as well. And Kuwait was obviously receiving all of these aid, military and security and infrastructural and economic aid packages from the US to fight Saddam Hussein and Iraq and the Ba'athists at the time. So with that, Jordan was sort of the small country, the small like piece of land. And I think like this is where we start seeing like a big emphasis on security. Like, we are fighting for the safety and security of our people, amin wal aman. We want our people to be safe. A recognition of the rising geopolitical tensions in the region, and then proposing safety and security as a solution to that, rather than a confrontation of the empire and a confrontation of the enemy. And so peacemaking became sort of this, peace became this idea that is like leveraged against the Jordanian people. Like, yes, we're normalizing, but you get peace instead. Yes, we are, we are falling into debt and taking all of these economic aid packages from the US, but you have peace, and we're developing our industry, obviously not for the people, just to fund the monopoly abroad. But yeah, you have these jobs, these USAID jobs, you have these NGO jobs, you have all of these refugee camps that are funded, and these international schools, and anglicization of the private school system, this modernization of Jordanian society, as opposed to this the regression of, for example, other societies towards Islamic resistance and their fall into continued and permanent warfare. We have peace and we have security, and that is the exchange that we're making. And I would say, like, honestly, I mean, looking back, I was born a few years later, but thinking about that time, I think that sort of rhetoric really was won, like it really was victorious at the time. It won. This idea of peace for a nation that had been surrounded by permanent, warfare, that had gone through a war on its own land in 1968, and even though they had defeated Zionist forces, had gone through more instability and more tensions on their own land with the aggression between the PLO and the Jordanian monarchy, which, by the way, included military operations on both sides, and deaths and so on. And like I mentioned, besiegement. The idea of peace, I think, was acceptable. And this is also where we see, like, Oslo. Like, this is the time where the Oslo Accords were being negotiated. This is the time where we're starting to think of, okay, like, Palestine, the idea of Palestine is now the state along the 1947 partition or the 1967 lines. And this is, and this is what we are fighting for. We're fighting for the state building effort. We are building these diplomatic institutions. We are installing a Palestinian Authority that is supposed to be a 5-year-long transitional government. And here we are later, almost 30 years later, with this, puppet regime at the head of Palestinian political, like, elite and Palestinian politics. At least when it comes to diplomacy, obviously, like, the resistance plays a political role as well. And so the conditions were, like, ripe for normalization. The conditions were ripe for the Jordan Valley Treaty, where Jordanian lands were leased to the Israelis for 25 years, only to be returned in a few years ago to Jordanians, still with Israeli settlers on them. So, like, there's literally Israeli settlers on Jordanian land as we speak. Still, like, during that time, Jordan still housed the offices, like regional offices of Palestinian political parties. So, for example, there was a PFLP office in Jordan. There was a Hamas office in Jordan. There was a DFLP office in Jordan, and so on. And so these offices existed in Jordan. And obviously the representatives of these parties lived in Jordan as well. And two of them were, or one of them was Khalid Mashal. For a small period of time, Musa Abu Marzouk was also there. But he went to Qatar, and now obviously Khalid Mashal is in Qatar, but at the time he was in Jordan. And the Hamas office, for those who know Amman, was Bill Gardens. So that's where the Hamas office was, in a very lively commercial and residential neighborhood in Jordan. They were living among the people and everything. And after the 1994 peace treaty, obviously Israelis were allowed to come to Jordan. They were allowed to enter Jordan with their Israeli passports, but at the time, the Mossad sent 3 or 4 agents, I think, under with Canadian passports into Jordan with the direction or the task of assassinating Khalid Mashal, the head of the Hamas bureau at the time, living in Jordan. And so this assassination attempt well, it was an assassination attempt that failed, but the actual like attempt succeeded, by which I mean like they actually managed to put Khalid Mash'al into a medical coma, and he was on the brink of death um, for I think a few days before he was rescued. But the reason I mentioned this assassination attempt is because King Hussein played a really interesting role at the time. The assassination attempt of Khalid Mash'al or or like a Hamas official or any Palestinian official on Jordanian land crossed the lines of this peace treaty and crossed the lines that that King Hussein had set in terms of diplomacy with the Zionist state. And so the reaction to this was leveraging the peace treaty against Bill Clinton and the Israelis because of this assassination attempt. So during that period in 1997, I think, King Hussein was willing to risk the peace treaty and completely erase it from existence because Jordanian sovereignty had been transgressed and because there was an assassination attempt of a Palestinian official on Jordanian land. And this was a very scary proposition, or like a scary idea for Bill Clinton, for the Americans and for the Israelis, because it meant that this buffer state would now become an actively confronting, it would enter a confrontational stance against them. And that was a scary proposition that the Jordanian army has been and still is trained by the US, before that the British. The Jordanian army has a lot of capabilities, not the most advanced technologies, of course, but because that would be a threat, right, to the region. So they're kept humble in the technologies that they have, but they are still trained up to this level of military prestige and so on. And so this was a threat to Israeli and to Israeli security at the time. And what happened was that the Israelis were refusing to give the antidote to the poison to the Jordanians. And there's a very good book about this. It's called Kill Khalid. And it sort of goes through the events of what happened, but just to say it super briefly, the Americans ended up compelling and forcing the Israelis to give the antidote to the Jordanians, and at the same time, the other Hamas officials that were supervising Khalid Mash'al at the time at the hospital during his coma were refusing any notion of taking an Israeli antidote to save Khalid Mash'al. And so they had initially insisted on having him go to the Islamic hospital, which is a Muslim Brotherhood hospital institution. But the king was against that and wanted to bring him to the King Hussein Medical Complex, the Royal Hospital, which is actually incidentally where a lot of public healthcare services are provided, and also to assign his doctors to figure out what sort of poison he was given and the antidote to that. They ended up figuring it out by themselves, but eventually King Hussein managed, nonetheless, to pressure the Americans to force the Israelis to give King Hussein the antidote. And what's really interesting is that 2 weeks before the assassination attempt, and this is what made it an extreme transgression of Jordanian statehood and sovereignty, and I think also the not the ego, but just the place of King Hussein as the king of Jordan. 2 weeks before the attempt, King Hussein had received some Israeli officials in his royal palace for a family vacation in the south of Jordan. And so these relationships were personal at the time, not just diplomatic. And so the attempt to assassinate a Palestinian political official and leader on Jordanian land was obviously this diplomatic and political transgression, but also a personal one. because the head of the Mossad had been right there in his own in the Jordanian monarch's own royal palace with his family on a family holiday in the south of Jordan just 2 weeks before, while planning this assassination attempt on this Hamas leader. And so all of these contradictions sort of existed in the same at the same time. And eventually Khalid Mish'al was rescued by these Jordanian doctors that were doctors to the king. But that sort of placed King Hussein in a position of power against the Americans and the Israelis at the time, because they realized that he was completely willing to leverage the peace treaty against them at any attempt to transgress Jordanian sovereignty and his power over his own land. And these two things, like the normalization on one hand, but also protection of Jordanian sovereignty and nationhood on the other, is what is sort of like received by the people as a commitment to Jordanian security and safety and peace and prowess of the monarchy's like proof of the monarchy's prowess and readiness to confront the enemy at any cost, with the smallest transgression of their sovereignties. And so I think, like, to me, like, that is one of my favorite stories to think about, or favorite moments in history to think about when I want to analyze King Hussein's role vis-a-vis the Palestinian struggle, vis-a-vis the Palestinian resistance, and Jordanian sovereignty, because it shows, like, his. Obviously, it was a very smart move, like leveraging the peace treaty was a very intelligent, very powerful move that no one expected, and it showed Jordanians his commitment, to fighting the enemy. And when King Hussein ended up passing away from cancer a few years later, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the street mourning him, and all throughout these years. To me, at least, like from reading about our history, learning like from my family and so on, some of whom were like involved in Palestinian politics and the Palestinian movement at the time when it was at the time when the PLO was allowed to be in Jordan. The love of the Jordanian people for the monarchy has only increased, even though the condition of Jordanians in Jordan has only worsened. And this is like a really interesting contradiction for me, because it's almost like, I mentioned in the piece that Jordanians are forced into the state of political tranquilization. Like, we are forced into an acceptance of conditions and the status quo, and also forced into like an undying and committed and permanent love to the ruling family, because the messages that we receive are, the Jordanian family, royal family, are custodians of Al-Aqsa and the Jerusalemite holy sites. The Jordanian royal family the Jordanian military joined the Palestinian resistance in the Battle of Karame to defeat the Israelis in 1968. And then we skip the period in which Palestinians in Jordan were facing militarized violence by the Jordanian state. And then, to be honest, we don't even talk about the assassination of Khalid Mish'al attempt in Jordan. I only learned about that a couple of years ago. And we move to, look at what's happening around us. There's a permanent state of warfare. Lebanon, rarely has a president or a prime minister. The economy is tanking. Iraq is being invaded by the US and is also put into the state of permanent de-development and warfare, and so on. Palestine is occupied, and the Palestinian people are enduring the occupation and the violence of the occupation. Syria is This is the rhetoric of the Jordanian state. Syria is suffering under the Assad regime. Syrians are revolting against the Assad regime, and Shia violence in Syria. And Iran is suppressing its people and stoning women in public and whatever. But we're fine. Like, yes, we paid a price for this. But the reward, which is peace and safety and security, is fine. And I think that we are reaching a point where, for many Jordanians, this is no longer an acceptable exchange. Like, this is no longer an acceptable reward for normalization and humiliation by the occupation and permanent underdevelopment, because we are completely relying on American economic aid packages. When US aid was shut down by Trump, so many Jordanians lost their jobs. And unlike the American and Western expats that were hired by US aid to come to Jordan, couldn't leave and find a different job. They are now unemployed. What the salary, the Western and international salary that they relied on, is no longer available for them. The cost of living is only increasing. Amman is one of the most expensive cities in the region. And yet people are being, arrested for opposing the Jordan International Food Festival while Gaza is being starved. People are being arrested and on the notion of being anti-state or anti-nation or anti-Jordan in all of its forms and characteristics for opposing this food festival, for opposing the Jarash festival, while Palestinians 3-4 hours away by car are being massacred and slaughtered and starved, and arrested for having the Palestinian flag in protests for Palestine, arrested for approaching the Israeli embassies too closely during a protest for Palestine, tear gassed, and so on, arrested for cyber crimes, which includes making a post on Facebook about Jordanian normalization, or making a post on Facebook or Twitter about cutting the gas deal, or speaking about the role of Jordan in normalizing. All of these journalists, including one of them, her name is Hiba Abu Taha, if I recall correctly, she had written a piece in the beginning of the war on Gaza about this hotel in the south of Jordan. And if you know, the south of Jordan is bordering the Red Sea, and so there's all of these resorts that are Emirati developments, actually. And all of this Emirati, like UAE, Saudi, American money that is poured into the development of these resorts and these hotels in the south. And of course, there's so many Israelis that come from the south of occupied Palestine to our land, because there's an airport there. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but during the Iranian strikes on the Zionist state, the airport in the south of Jordan was overflowing with Israelis escaping. And there was what is effectively a media gag order about that. You could get arrested for speaking about this. You could get arrested for speaking about how Jordan had crushed, for, whether you agree with it or not, for whatever reason, had crushed the Muslim Brotherhood party in the past few months, after there was this they uncovered allegedly this attempt to stage a coup against the Jordanian monarchy. And so this journalist, Hiba Abu Taha, had written this piece and this investigative piece about this hotel that was receiving all of these Israelis for holidays during the war on Gaza. And she was jailed for months. Like 4 months, she was put in jail, arrested on the charge of I'm not sure if it was treason or if it was insulting the head of the state, which is actually a real charge in Jordan. or cyber crimes or so on. But this is the reality that Jordanians are living under. And I think the most impoverished, the most destitute, the most struggling Jordanians are starting to realize that these contradictions are only worsening, are only sharpening, and that the longer this goes on, the worse conditions will be. And there has to be a solution, right? Like there has to be a way out of this. And it doesn't seem like peacemaking with the occupier, with the enemy, is actually helping, you know?
Thank you, like, for sharing all of that. I mean, I think it's really important. There's always, we hear a lot of, I think, questions sometimes about like why are people in Jordan or Egypt or something else like not rising up and all of these things. And I think people often don't have a very good sense of like how intense the repression or the even the level of surveillance that people are under, right? And the consequences for even minimal acts of solidarity or protest or things like that. And so I appreciate you kind of sharing all of that. The other thing I just wanted to say too is that moment you talked about during the peace process, and also is the same moment of Oslo. I mean, there's so many, as you said, kind of peace processes that are going on at the time. There's also the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, um, between the British government, basically sort of ending the quote unquote troubles, but basically ending the armed struggle, for in exchange basically for Sinn Féin becoming a political party that was above ground. Um, and then in South Africa, of course, there's a series of kind of negotiations and accords that, basically then in 91, you have the National Peace Accord, which leads eventually to the Truth and Reconciliation process there. In Yugoslavia, you have the Dayton Agreement, and there's also a series of them. I won't list them all that happened within Eastern Europe, basically as countries came out of the Eastern Bloc, basically with the end of the Cold War. And so I just say that to say, and as somebody who did grow up in that era, the it was very much a period where this idea of peace was like very dominant politically. It was kind of a hegemonic idea of like let's the Cold War is ending and let's settle all of these places where, I mean, as folks have said, the Cold War was cold in the USSR and the US, but it was hot like everywhere in the global South, right? And so it was like kind of as that winds down and the USSR falls, you have all of these agreements. And I think an important thing for people to understand about that period too is that, in all of these instances, the folks who are fighting for national liberation or sovereignty or socialism, like they weren't making these agreements on good footing in this era. Like they're making this agreement in a context where the socialist bloc and the non-aligned movement kind of would have been previously the thing that provided them with some support for national liberation or socialism or whatever, and they lose that, right? And so they're making an agreement that on one level, the US and Western imperialists have some incentive themselves to make these agreements because they want to normalize, they want to be able to extract more capital, extract resources, etc., from these various areas around the globe. But it's not I think about this because I had someone the other day bring up South Africa and whether the ANC kind of sold out South Africa in the agreement that they made to end apartheid. And my response to that was like, it's really hard to say that because like, what was the alternative for the ANC in the period? Well, it wouldn't have been very likely that the ANC would have propelled a really hard line like national liberation. We're going to be socialists. We don't, because who were they going to trade with, right? Who were they going to rely on for security and all of these things. And so I just think it's important for folks to have that kind of global context when we talk about that period of the 90s, and all of these peace processes that happened. And also, I think people did have, like you said, people were tired of war. War is hellish, right? We see that every day. And they had incentive to say, okay, like, let's give peace a chance. I think that was like one of the slogans of the era is like, give peace a chance,
I think
right?
it's like a John Lennon song or something. I think he had a song about giving peace a chance with like Yoko Ono. Yeah.
That's probably right. Yeah. And so yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add that context for people too, because I think it is quite easy for us in hindsight to look back on that period and say, oh, like all these different people kind of sold out and abandoned their struggles or whatever. But it became very difficult with the fall of the USSR. Not that all of these states were like USSR proxies or whatever, but it at least posed a kind of split in um, political economy globally and stuff, so that folks had alternatives that they could go to and sometimes they kind of played an in-between role of like, okay, well, we'll do some stuff, we'll do some trade with the Americans or whatever, but we'll also, work with the non-aligned movement. And like, you really have that rise of what we call the unipolar world
Mhm.
at that period. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. Um, so let's see. So is there more you want to say? You kind of have outlined it a little bit along the way, but about your own experiences in Jordan, kind of the education system there, and some of the realities of Palestinians in Jordan in more recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I um I went, as everyone can tell by my English and my accent, I went to a private international school in Jordan um for most of my life, because for a bit we didn't live in Jordan, but um and so I was, you know, mostly English educated for most of my school life. And like as a result of these, schools being international and so on, the books that we had were from Oxford and Cambridge. Like, they were published by those presses, and they were history, history, science, and so on. But I think, like, really where you see the most like the clearest sign of these books really being like international, and by international, like really like not belonging to our region, like not belonging to the to the mainstream discourse, not belonging to the way that we think and speak among each other, like especially given that so many of us are Palestinian, is when you look at high school level history books that are published by Oxford, Cambridge, and so on, and Macmillan or whatever. Um, like I mentioned this in the piece, but I think like one of the first like moments of like, oh my God, like what am I reading? Like what are we being taught? Um, was in grade 10. And so I was like 15. We sort of like we had this sort of structure where we choose specific modules from the book. And so the modules that were chosen were the Cold War and the American Civil Rights Movement. The African American Civil Rights Movement is what it was called in the book. And that book also did have a chapter, though, or a module on the Arab-Israeli conflict. But we didn't touch that, and we didn't even acknowledge it. And one day there was someone in the school that was flipping through the book and found a picture of a Palestinian guerrilla wearing the kufiyyah, masked, and engaging in guerrilla warfare, in that he was hiding behind this rock and was clearly in like either in a guerrilla training camp or during a confrontation and so on. And the caption under that was Palestinian terrorist doing whatever, like in Jordan in 1970 or 69 or something. I think it was 70. And so like it was a moment where obviously like I'm a 15-year-old, right? Like I'm not yet a politically developed person. And I didn't grow up in a very political home. Like obviously we're Palestinian and we talk about that. Like, you know, we've always been known that we are Palestinian. We've always known where we're from. My uncle actually is one of the in our own family, like one of the greatest record keepers of our family's like archives and the family tree and so on. And so like we know all of this, you know, like I was taught like the names of my great grandfathers and I'm able to trace my family back to where they had settled 700 years ago in Jerusalem, in Palestine, in the Mount of Olives, and we know all of these things. But other than that, it wasn't like a political home per se. And so I was like really like obviously taken aback and confused. And the mainstream discourse is obviously Palestinians are not terrorists. Israel is the enemy. And why is this something that exists in our book, in our history books? And there was some like ruckus in the school. Like there was some like conversation and discussion around it, but obviously nothing happened because of, I don't know, like contracts or whatever that the school had signed. It was an IB school. This is the program that you get and the program that you're going to teach the kids. And like, that's it. But I think like I never forgot that moment because it just really stayed with me, because I was thinking, you know, like all my life I've grown up thinking that, thinking and knowing that Israel and the Zionist state and the Zionist occupation is the enemy. And that at the same time, Jordan took us in and protected us and had given us the citizenship and nationality for us to live, for my grandparents to live, to have their children. My parents were born in Jordan, and for their children to have children and so on. And so I was like committed to that Palestinian Jordanian identity. And obviously like with the making of my political consciousness, and then at the same time the undoing or like the unraveling of that Palestinian Jordanian identity as a result, and like I always kept going back to that memory, because to me like there were two things that were really important about it. Like one of them was that this book was allowed to be taught or bought by us as students in Jordan. Even if we went to a private school, like the education regulations in Jordan are very, very like strict. Like just because it's a private school doesn't mean you don't actually get some sort of review or regulation or whatever from the Ministry of Education, minus like I think very small cases where it's like truly like an international school where it's just the children of diplomats and like CIA officers that go. But like you can't really like escape that sort of, you know, regulation or surveillance from the Ministry of Education. The second thing was that we had completely like skipped the chapter when really like this should be exactly what we should be learning about, right? Like we're literally in Jordan. We are Arab and we are, you know, this was during actually the war on Gaza in 2014, because that's when I was 15. And so during like an active assault on Palestine, or like, I guess, an active and accelerated assault and aggression on the people of Gaza and on Palestine. And so to me, I was like, first of all, like, how is this book even available for us? And why are we even using this book? Like, there are so many other books that we could use. And secondly, given that this book has a chapter on our own history, why are we not learning it? And then obviously as I got older, I realized that the Cold War chapter was also extremely fucked up. Like, you know, it was completely demonizing Jamal Abdel Nasser. It was completely demonizing any sort of pan-Arab thought or movement or, you know, idea of a unified Arab nation or unified Arab peoples fighting against US imperialism. And so like, and that's like a very, that's the experience of a minority in Jordan. You know what I mean? Like those of us who go to these private schools, who are English educated, who use these history books, are a very small minority in Jordan, and like a smaller minority in Amman, like in the capital city. And most people are going to public schools. Most people are using the or going to private schools that are using the national education program. And in the past few years, so many of these books have been changed to reflect, obviously, the desire um, of the states, or like the state's desire um, for like what they want the people to think of them, right? Like Jordan is, I think, one of the greatest examples of state propaganda, visual, like educational, like um, everything, like even in terms of the national songs, even in terms of like how many flags you see when you're driving, in terms of what you're learning in school and so on. And so I just started thinking about how many of us obviously are propagandized and are, you know, given this or like fed this propaganda and accept it and move on with life with that. But also I was thinking about with the recent with the past 2 years, the undoing of that propaganda for people, despite the country's greatest efforts to keep it alive. In May, so like 4 months before recording this, I think it was in May, there was this new law that was passed in Jordan about the Jordanian flag. And so I'm not sure about like the actual specifics, but essentially, in short, every building has to have the Jordanian flag. And then a sub point of that law is every building can only have one flag. So, so, you have the Jordanian flag and you don't have an option to put another flag. And I had been in Jordan. I went this summer back home, and I also went the year before in 2024, before the 1 year anniversary of the war on Gaza and the genocide, and the visual difference between the amount of Palestinian flags and red triangles and pro-Palestine graffiti and billboards, like literal billboards with QR codes to donate, water bottles that were that had the Palestinian map as part of their logo. And this summer, where every 5 meters there's a Jordanian flag, the billboards are gone. The logos on commercial goods that depict any sort of support for Palestine are gone. The whole time I was there was only one protest. It was in front of the American embassy, and 9 people were violently arrested, and there's video footage of that. And also, while I was there was this social media influencer that made a video critique of the Jordan International Food Festival online, immediately taken and arrested too. And so I can only imagine how much of that undoing of this propaganda is being experienced by a lot of Jordan's youth, in parallel with the difficulty of life in Jordan, in parallel with how expensive life is, with how unaffordable it is to like send your children to a school, how unaffordable it is to get food on the table. Some people make only 200 JDs a month, and that's like, a salary for like an entire family. 200 JDs a month is about 400 Canadian dollars. So like 320 US dollars a month in one of the most expensive places in the entire region. And to me, like what I see coming in the future for us, like as Palestinian youth living in Jordan or from Jordan, as Jordanian youth living in Jordan, is like a sharpening of those contradictions. It's inevitable. Like there will be a breaking point, and like the monarchy and the state is faced with this, with this choice. Like you either suppress the people further, or you listen to the will of the people and cut the normalization deals, cut the gas deals, stop giving us water that's stolen from Palestinian land. Stop giving our houses and our homes and our whatever electricity that is stolen from Palestinians and rerouted to us in exchange for normalization, in exchange for non-confrontation, in exchange for like being like politically debilitated and suppressed like as a people. and I can only see it getting more intense. I can only see the tensions rising going forward. Like the youth are trying to get involved and are suppressed at every single attempt to get involved, but there's still, like, to me, like what I'm witnessing is the growth of these smaller political parties, like the Jordanian Communist Party, the growth of these youth organizations, the growth of the BDS Jordan movement, despite all the repression. Um, and yeah, like now there's just like this choice for the Jordanian people, and there's a choice for the monarchy and the ruling family. Do we fight against the repression, or do we accept just being, like I said, like politically tranquilized, and silenced and suppressed and repressed, while barely being able to afford to live? Or, do we fight against this, and then on the other hand, do we crush all forms of opposition and dissent and like expression of the willingness for a better future, in order to save, the nation state, or this idea of a nation state, under or living through or under US hegemony? And that's like the question that I think about all the time. And as like someone who grew up in Jordan, someone who, like, I can't not love my home, right? Like, I grew up there. Obviously, like, I'm attached to it. The idea of like thinking about my youth and thinking about, I've always wanted to go back there and work like with my people and for my people and so on. And I can only imagine how many people are asking themselves that question too.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the same thing, but I think there's kind of the question that you pose there, and those sort of, two options or two potential realities, I think is the question facing so much of humanity right now on some level, right? Is like, we did a recent conversations are always on my mind when I have discussions with people, but we just published one with Karina Mullen, and she has a piece on Palestine as the hornet's nest of US empire, but it's also a piece where she's talking about this idea, which she pulls from George Jackson as well, of a kind of international fascist counter-revolution, and thinking about fascism as just an expression of capitalism that is much more global than people often think about it. It's not just like, an individual state, choosing to, crush dissent and, go after minorities and things like that. But it's a way that capitalism responds to a kind of crisis of accumulation, really, like a crisis of how to kind of sustain itself. And I think that, in many ways, as in this moment where I think US empire is in decline, and it is willing, as we have seen with what it has supported and funded the Zionist entity in doing over the last couple of years in Gaza, and increasingly in the West Bank, and also to countries all around it, right? That, we just have to reckon that we may be in a moment where, the ICE agents coming into Los Angeles or whatever are not distinct from that kind of reality, right? But it's a more generalized phenomena of how the capitalist ruling class on a kind of global level is looking to deal with people who resist, what it desires to do, what it, its plans, right? And I think that, Jordan might just be one of those places where that is just so stark that it's easier to see sometimes than it is when you're, within US empire or something like that, yeah. So let's see. So maybe there's a little more you want to add on this. I had one more question here for you, which is just a little more on your analysis of the current period. There's a sentence from your piece that I noted, which was, quote, occupied by neoliberal aid packages and foreign development projects, Jordan's capitalist economy remains dependent on US-led imperialism in fact, it can only survive as a structural byproduct of US-led imperialism, end quote. Is there more that you want to say on this point?
I mean, I think like, to be honest, like the closure or like the end of US aid, and all of these foreign aid packet US aid packages by Trump was like the best depiction of what it means to be a structural byproduct of US-led imperialism. And that doesn't, it doesn't even, like, it's not limited to Jordan, but just for the purposes of our discussion, um, Jordan is sort of like this place that is stuck in time until the US graces it with foreign aid packages, or until the United Arab Emirates decides to like invest in the economy and invest in like resort developments in the south or in the Dead Sea and so on. And part of that is this NGO industrial complex, like the NGOization of the aid economy and so on. And like on the other hand, or like the other like side of the same coin is this like mass exodus or like brain drain of Jordanian and Arab youth from the region in order to sell their labor in the heart of empire in the US and Canada and Europe and so on, because this dependence on like like the Jordanian economy's dependence on these aid packages is proving to be not only unsustainable but just like unproductive. There is very, very, very little Jordanian national production of goods, of commodities. There's very little Jordanian labor power that is not associated with US hegemony and US economy and the US monopoly on capital. And these neoliberal projects and these aid packages and these foreign like development initiatives in Jordan have sort of like, I think, lulled people into the state of like, I'm making a foreign salary in Jordan, I'm able to live and so on, and I'm okay with that for now, until like the acceleration of US fascism in the past, like since Trump was elected, and not that it didn't exist before, but just that it was massively accelerated. And the end of these aid packages and all these people just finding themselves without any jobs or income or any source of like support for their lives and their livelihood. And this is like, and this includes things like, just the day-to-day things like all these, Jordan and Amman specifically is like a food economy. There's so many places to eat and so many places to drink and so many places to go and have these amazing foods and so on. But if you actually trace back who owns these restaurants, who has this monopoly on the Jordanian food industry, it's these Emiratis, it's these Gulf Arabs, it's these Americans, it's these foreign development funds that are trying to make Jordan like a tourist hub, which it is, but now in the past 2 years, not really, except for Israelis for some reason. Like they just keep coming. And, one of the hostages, after she was released, she went to Petra, like, and was taking pictures there and did a photo shoot. Like this is the state of like what we're living in and what people are living through in Jordan. But like the tentacles of US imperialism and US hegemony, and the economic dependence of Jordan on the US is everywhere. Like there is nowhere where the US is not involved. And that's not to say that the US is the only one that is involved in this. Like obviously there's the UAE, there's also a lot of Japanese investment in Jordanian development, and some Chinese investment recently in the past few years. But like I think like if we actually want to understand like this, the place of Jordan as like what I say is like a structural byproduct of the US empire, um, we have to go back to the formation of Jordan as a nation state in the first place. And I think like for this, like to go like much deeper into it, if anyone wants to read more about it, Joseph Masad has a really good book about it called Colonial Effects: The Making of Jordanian National Identity. And it was written in the year 2000. And so some of it is actually and I hope that eventually he ends up writing like a sequel or something that includes an analysis of the past 25 years, because so much has changed since then. But like the formation of Jordan as this like buffer zone geographically between the Israeli occupation, the Palestinian resistance, the Lebanese resistance, the role of Syria in being a place for the supply of arms and resources to the resistance. Of course, that's no longer the case. And Iran's role in the region. Jordan was like the buffer zone in exchange for these aid packages that are I'm like forgetting the word, that leech of like Jordanian development. I'm not sure if this is like the right expression, but like in exchange for like Jordanian development, you get these endless debts. In exchange for Jordanian development of the economy, you get these massive US embassy compounds in Amman. You get these schools that are created by the US, like the American community schools, that have these walls around them to protect them from whatever attack on them. I don't know why they're like super stressed about it, but this is actually one of the schools that I meant by where the children of these diplomats and the CIA officers that live in Jordan go. The existence of Jordan as this hub for US surveillance, the existence of Jordan as a place where a NATO office was readily welcomed and opened on our land, on Jordanian land. The existence of Jordan where our military and police force are trained in US-funded camps and at the time, British-funded camps, where despite most of Jordan's population being Palestinian, where the official state position is normalization and is diplomacy with an occupying state, and is the crushing of any sort of dissent or opposition to those political decisions. And that's what I mean by a structural byproduct. Like imperialism, the way that it functions is, or the way that I like to explain it, like, and for people to be able to like digest it, is in two ways, or like it has two arms. There's the military arm and there's the economic arm. The militarization through which like imperialism functions in our region is through these like the propping up of these state apparatuses, right? Like the military, the police force, the state, like the state itself. Like by the state itself, I mean like the regime, like the ruling political class. And then economically, in parallel to that, and with that specifically, is creating this economic infrastructure in the country, in the region, to sustain that like militarization, the economic infrastructure to produce continue to produce and reproduce these conditions, to continue to produce and reproduce these state apparatuses and the status quo, but also to continue to produce and reproduce the dominant ideological tendencies in the region, or the dominant ideological discourse, or the dominant political conditions, or discourse in the region. And so the presence of these NGOs and nonprofits and these American funded and British funded and founded schools is this obviously like this economic plays this economic role, but very clearly, to me at least, plays this ideological, like has this ideological intervention, makes this ideological intervention in our region. If you work for for an agency, whether it's UN or USAID or Amid East or whatever, part of your contract is not being political. Like, what does that even mean, right? Like, is that not like a political stance in and of itself? Like, is that not an accepting of permanent silencing in exchange for a US blood-stained paycheck every month? And like these ideological interventions that the empire makes through the education system, through this, NGO, the NGO industry, these, making Jordan this tourist hub that is like trying to be Beirut, but it's not completely Beirut because it's a bit more conservative, but it's less conservative than Saudi Arabia. Like, placing Jordan in this like really nice middle ground of like compromise. We're still open, but we're not too open, but we're, this is a Muslim country, but not like Saudi Arabia or Iran. And we have all of these beaches and so on. And we also have these English schools, and we also have all of this investment and so on. And we also accept refugees and, like all of these things, like the creation of the Jordanian nation state, through these militarized and economic US-led interventions, or I would say like impositions on our people and encroachment and so on, eventually permeates like the day-to-day life of Jordanians. Like the day-to-day life becomes depoliticization, not because it just says it in your contract, but because this is just the way to live. The day-to-day life becomes an acceptance of the way that things are. The day-to-day life becomes just alienation from your potential for politicization, alienation from your labor power, alienation from also the fruits of your labor or the lack thereof, alienation from your condition as a Palestinian Jordanian or as a Jordanian living in Jordan, trying to make ends meet while, the political elite are benefiting not just off of your labor, but also benefiting off of US intervention on your own land, in your own land, and this permeation, like, of that like ideology and the dominant discourse is like what I also like mention in the piece is like what makes you like a good citizen. Like it makes you a good citizen of whatever state, like the nation state that you are in is the like unconscious alignment with the status quo, like unconscious alignment with the way that things are, the way that things are supposed to be, and the way that they're going to be forever. Because who are we to change things? And I can barely put food on the table, and so I don't have time to get politically engaged and politically involved, when that is precisely why we should be getting politically engaged and politically involved. And to be like this good citizen, and what I say, like to belong to Jordan, like to belong to the Jordanian nation, to belong to the Jordanian state, you have to accept this permeation, like this insidious permeation of US hegemony in our day-to-day, like daily life, to a degree that if someone takes a step back and takes a look at it, you start questioning, like, are we really like sovereign? Like, is this what sovereignty means? Is this what being an Arab sovereign nation, independent, independence nation means? And is what we are given in exchange worth like the price of this suppression and repression and depoliticization and alienation, and also just the difficulty of life, and also how much more difficult will life be really if we start to confront these contradictions. And I think like part of the way that propaganda, like state propaganda, I mean, begins to succeed is in it's instilling this fear in people of how much worse it could be if they actually do confront the status quo. But really, like the question or the idea that I think about all the time is it's going to get worse either way, right? You know, it either gets worse at your expense or, you know, we do something and organize ourselves and perhaps make some sacrifices, but for a better future for our children and our people and just like our lands, like this Arab land that is being assaulted and encroached upon by these foreigners, these US, British colonizers for years and years and years. At some point, like it has to be enough, right? And to me, like, you know, the fact that Jordanians can hardly put food on the table, can hardly pay the electricity bill, can hardly pay the bill for water, which is water that is stolen from Palestinians by Israelis and given to us in exchange for a normalization deal. That is more than enough.
Thank you so much. That's such a great conclusion kind of on your remarks and on this piece. Is there anything else that you want to say or share or shout out before I let you go?
Thank you so much for like having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. And also, yeah, like I said in the beginning, I listen to this podcast all the time. So it's cool, like a couple of years after beginning to listen to this podcast, like for some reason I'm on it. But yeah, thank you for having me and for opening space for this discussion. And I hope that like, you know, that these questions that I was asking or like starting to ask in our discussion and in that piece begin to like undo some of that forced depoliticization that we are subjected to, not just in Jordan, but obviously like here in the West and really everywhere where the dominant force is US hegemony and the empire and alignment with Western hegemony.
Yeah, I hope so too. And it's not for some reason. You wrote a great piece, and I'm honored to have you on to have this discussion. And it's been a great conversation. So thanks again for joining me. And I look forward to sharing this with folks in the coming days.
Thank you so much.